Hey everybody, welcome back to another bonus episode of Blowback Season 3. In this episode, Noah will be talking to Thomas Powell, the son of John Powell, a journalist who, during the Korean War, published evidence of germ warfare used by U.S. forces against the communist side. For this, John Powell was tried for sedition unsuccessfully by the U.S. government. Thomas, a writer and sculptor, has for many years defended his father's work. And in this episode, Noah will speak with Thomas about both his parents' experiences in Asia, in which they witnessed everything from the Chinese Revolution to the ugliest moments of the Korean War, and Thomas's own attempt to preserve his father's work. So enjoy this episode, a chat between Noah and Thomas Powell.
What is the thing that drew you to writing about or researching the Korean War?
Well, I inherited this topic from my father. It was his project, which he didn't complete. I just found that his work was being denied and trashed by political forces in this country, and I objected to that, and I got pissed off about it, and I started researching, and then I just got caught up in the story. I mean, it's an enormous historical plot here. It's just astounding, the characters and the people and the actions and the denials and the lies and the political machinations behind the scene. And I just have become kind of captivated by the story itself, and also from sort of a moral outrage. And that's what's pushed me to continue doing the research.
And I guess to go back to your folks for a minute, for the uninitiated, who were your parents?
Well, my father's name was John William Powell. He was from Missouri. He was born in China. His father had been recruited by an entrepreneur to go to China and start a newspaper in 1917. And he started this newspaper and then returned to China to run it, and then eventually bought it. And it was called the China Weekly Review. And the paper was shut down by the Japanese when they invaded and occupied Shanghai. And my grandfather was imprisoned by the Japanese. My father served in World War II and was stationed in Chongqing, where the nationalist government was, and he reopened the newspaper after the war, and his politics began moving sharply to the left in opposition to the U.S. government's very reactionary approach to reestablishing the colonial order. He was not raised as a leftist and a radical. He had a very sort of comfortable childhood in Missouri, raised by his aunt and uncle who were middle class. His mother's family had been bankers, and so he was a businessman. His politics were liberal, but as he became impressed with the communists and the Chinese Revolution, he stayed in China after the revolution, and he saw that they were reformers as well as revolutionaries, and so he reported this in his newspaper. And then as the U.S. policy became more reactionary, Truman moved sharply to the right. Both Truman, the Truman administration moved to the right in order to fill the sort of void of left by global fascism. U.S. and British as well moved their politics sharply to the right to sort of fill this void. And the U.S. was then starting to supply troops and armaments and funding to the Dutch and the French to reestablish their colonies in the in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia. And he opposed that, and he opposed the funding of Chiang Kai-shek, even though he had been a friend of my grandfather's, a personal friend. And he, but Chiang was completely corrupt, and his government was corrupt.
One question for you there is, so one element of our show this season is a theme that we're talking about is exactly this moment you're discussing in the 1940s. And so when you say that your father was, deeply impressed, or, not in a good way, like in the sense that it was an impression was left on him by the reactionary American policy in the Far East at that time, as they called it. What was this, reactionary policy, particularly in Japan, I guess, given that that's where American power was so concentrated, that, made the impression that it did on your father when he was in China at that time, and that, helped push him to the left, as you sort of say it?
The Japanese we Americans and Westerners underestimated Asians, and thought they were less civilized and less intelligent. The Japanese sent out emissaries to study the European models of governance. And they liked the German model, the authoritarian model, much better than they liked the British model or the French models, which were chaotic, involved parliaments and debate and stuff. And that didn't really sit well with the sort of hierarchical nature of governance that the autocratic centralized government that Japan was more familiar with. And so they adopted the German model. In regard to biological warfare, when Japan launched its sort of bid to become empirical, a capitalist empirical, the first victim was Korea. And they successfully, by fighting against the Russians in the Japanese-Russo War, they were able to get concessions from the Russians for control over Korea. Previously, they had fought the Qin government in China and had wrested away Taiwan and Korea's concessions of that war. But all that took place at the turn of between the 18th and the 19th century. BW became a weapon, and they chose BW, and Ishii really was the brainchild of this, because they realized that their great rivals for empire in the Far East were going to be China and Russia, which later became the Soviet Union. But these were two enormous countries with huge material resources and far more populous than Japan. Japan is 4 rocky islands and a bunch of smaller ones, and does not have fossil fuels, and is low in material resources. And therefore, they were going to need to, if they were going to take on China and Russia as in their empire building, they were going to need to kill an awful lot of Russians and Chinese. That they were going to need to have weapons of mass destruction that would be overwhelming.
I think it's also, to your point earlier about like the way in which, Westerners like maybe underestimate or would portray something like this as like, uniquely savage or whatever. I think like the thing that comes to mind that this brings up just to my mind is around the same time in the US, you have the Air Tactical Corps School and the whole fiasco with Billy Mitchell, where you have, what has been, kind of retconned as this history of like, generals arguing about the future of the skies is kind of a similar argument to what Ishii was sort of putting forward about the necessity of how we can project the most possible destruction abroad, given our technological or military capabilities. And, in different contexts, they come up with different answers, but those questions do, I guess, feel kind of universal for burgeoning empires.
Yeah, well, if you're empirical, it means that you want to fight your wars on foreign soil. It's a much different war if you're being invaded and you have to defend your home turf than it is if you are the invader and that you're bombing and wreaking havoc on another territory. It's just the quality of war and the style and the tactics and everything are completely different. And if you're the invader, you got to kill a lot of people. That's the bottom line in modern war. We've gone to the concept over the last 150, 200 years to the idea of total war. That's sort of the basic philosophy of warfare now, is that it's not between armies, it's between nations, and that there are no innocents, that everybody who lives within a nation is a potential adversary, because it's the entire war machine of the state against another war machine of a state, and all the little cogs are essential at some level and can all be attacked. And so that's why mass annihilation and weapons of mass destruction have become so important, biological, chemical, and radiological weapons, as they kill a hell of a lot of people.
Yeah. And so, obviously the US found a great deal of value in that, because they ended up taking hundreds of Japanese in a kind of, Pacific paperclip as part of the effort to learn and apply, ostensibly apply some of the Japanese research and methods. There had been use of these, as you were saying earlier, the Japanese used these weapons, or at the very least tested some of these tools and weapons on Koreans, well before the Korean War, but under the auspices of Japanese Empire. Could you talk a little bit more about what that was, if you know about it?
Well, the Japanese went full fast forward into the BW weapons program. That they first they sent Ishii on a world tour in 1928 and 30. They sent him out for a couple of years as a spy to visit all parts of the globe to see what was going on in bacteriological warfare and chemical warfare, and take notes and report back. And he did this. He's a very smart guy. He was able to determine that all the countries of Europe were full tilt boogie into chemical warfare. They all had highly developed programs in that, but very few were doing research into biological warfare.
What's the distinction?
Well, biological, you're working with living agents, you're working with diseases, you're working with pathogens, which can be weaponized. And you give people diseases and they die from exposure to the diseases. Whereas chemical warfare, you're dealing with toxic agents, that are inert gases and solvents, whatever it might be. And you spray these into the air and people respire them or get them on their skin or something, or like Agent Orange, which is gasoline mixed with a coagulant that won't allow you to rub it off your skin with a gelatin. And but that's chemical warfare, where you're spewing large amounts of toxins and killing agents.
And as far as the I guess to what you were saying about the development of these programs and their use earlier.
So what Ishii discovered on this world tour was that nobody was into biological weapons. They hadn't quite figured out the potential yet. That wasn't even being discussed, and he dreamed it up. And so he said, whoa, this is a wide open opportunity. If we get the jump on this, we'll be decades ahead of everybody else. We really need to launch into it full bore. And so he went back to Japan, and he convinced his handlers back there, his superior officers, that this was the way to go, and they agreed with him. And he got the funding, and he got the approval right up to the emperor's family to start this program. And they set him up in after the Mukden incident, and they Japanese had occupied Manchuria and created this puppet state of Manchukuo. Well, they set him up with a factory to start producing BW weapons. And it's kind of an interesting story about how the program grew from water purification and sort of disease prevention into full-bore experimentation on living human beings.
How does Korea come into the picture as the Japanese occupation widens or extends, or, also includes Korea?
Well, they didn't, the Japanese did not have a BW program in Korea. That didn't come until the U.S. War.
Got it.
In Korea. The Koreans were colonized people, and that they were part of the Japanese war machine. That Japan invested a lot of money and resources into Korea because Korea was feudal, that nothing new had happened in Korea in 500 years. And the Japanese investment was tremendous. And the Koreans were a labor force. And they also brought Koreans to Japan and put them to work in factories in Japan. That they just were, the intent of the Japanese was to Japanicize Korea. That they required that Koreans speak Japanese and learn Japanese in school. That they were out to wipe out the culture of Korea.
Well, and then once the Japanese imperial project is, ended in it's subsumed into the, Atlantic order after World War II. And its industrialization, continues, and so on. But its military is, neutered and repurposed to serve the need of countering Soviet power as part of the international Cold War. Obviously, that has, huge implications for this really vital, sensitive weaponry that they've been working on, as you're talking about. So what happens then in that context?
During World War II, the Japanese were fighting the Chinese, and they were fighting both the nationalist Chinese and the communist Chinese. And there had been a civil war going on in China for the decade preceding that between these factions for control over China. And the Japanese were had set up this factory at Pingfang train station outside of Harbin, China. And this was their main BW production plant that was run by Shiro Ishii. But it was supposedly to be a water purification plant. That was what it was supposedly designed to do, was for disease prevention. But it was a very large factory, and it had a very large prison. And it wasn't just soldiers. They were just rounding up any sort of unsuspecting people, Russians, whomever they could capture, a few Americans. And they were performing experiments. And this is a very notorious site now. It's kind of a tourist destination now to go and see the ruins of it. There's a museum there. But it's very gruesome. This is where they practiced. There's quite a few books out on this topic of Unit 731, and it's quite a well-known history now. When the Soviets invaded Manchuria and North Korea at the very end of World War II, on Nagasaki Day. The day of the bombing of Nagasaki was the day of the Russian invasion of North Korea and Manchuria. Ishii and his top lieutenants there, his staff, they destroyed the factory at Pingfang. They dynamited the place. They took a bunch of their materials, in fact, quite a bit of materials with them, and they escaped. And they fled down to the Yellow Sea. They commandeered passage on a boat, and they got back to Japan. And so they were hiding out. Ishii was in Tokyo and in the suburbs of Tokyo. So when the U.S. landed and came ashore in Japan after the surrender, the U.S. had heard about this BW. MacArthur had gotten wind of the BW activity going on, and he had, started looking for it and started looking for Ishii and the other people. And Willoughby, his intelligence chief, had located them.
A quick question, I guess. This process that MacArthur is doing, is it like, is this like MacArthur operating wholly under his authority, independent, uncoordinated from, say, the way that the Gellin organization types are being recruited into the fold in the Atlantic?
I'm not sure. I think that MacArthur operated independently at a lot of different levels with staffs until later, but he was operating under the direction of the War Department at that time. He couldn't completely operate solely, but this is a very different time when communication is a lot slower and there's a lot more independent activity and less second guessing. And he was quite, self-assuming of his own role and importance. So he obviously didn't tell, the War Department everything that he was engaged in. And General Willoughby, was a Nazi sympathizer. He was a fascist going back to his childhood in Austria. And so they kept a lot of it buttoned up. But they located these Ishii and Wakamatsu and Kitano and Naito and some of these other scientists that had collaborated, and they put the thumbscrews on them. And slowly they got them to agree to collaborate. And the BW program that the U.S. ran in Korea during the war was essentially the Japanese BW program, being supervised by the U.S. and delivered by U.S. planes and U.S. pilots. It was essentially a Japanese, and that's what the investigators all discovered, was that these tactics and methods of the U.S. biological war effort in the Korean War was the continuation of the Japanese BW program in Manchuria.
And this is, I guess, also sort of roughly speaking, when the work of your dad comes into the story, where in Korea at the time of these first uses, your dad is one of the first, if not the first person to report, right, about the allegations that are coming from the battle, that are coming from on the ground, that there are biological weapons being deployed in Korea.
Yes, that's correct.
How did your dad first encounter the story? Like, what was the proverbial phone call in the night that there had been biological weapons used, and what were the details he heard?
Well, he'd been in China in 1940. He had been there prior to the outbreak of World War II, and he was back in China in 1942 in Chongqing doing reports for the Office of War Information. And so he got information. He knew about the Chinese BW, the Japanese BW program in Manchuria, because that was knowledge that news people had about that. They weren't reporting on it, but there was there was rumors of it. And then in 1947, after the war crimes trials in the Far East there in Japan, the Tokyo Tribunal concluded without any discussion of biological war crimes. The Soviets and the Chinese insisted that BW had to be in the record of the war, the official historical record of the war, and so they organized the second war crimes tribunal in Kharbarovsk in Siberia. And they brought Japanese General Otaza that they had captured, who was the head of the Kwangtung Army, General Otawa, I believe his name was. They put him on trial, and about 10 or 11 subordinates. And they got confessions with them. They got the whole details of Unit 731 and its mission, found out all about the Pingfang factory, about the experiments, and they revealed this, and they publicized it. And everybody in Asia knew about it then. It was not reported in the American press, and it wasn't reported much in any Western press. Part of the reason is, and they described it as a show trial, as a communist show trial. And there is a very big difference in the way trials are held in the United States and the way trials are held throughout most of the rest of the world. That they're both legal processes, but in the U.S., you're presumed innocent. You have a right to question the witnesses, and the witnesses have to give public testimony and such. In most other countries in the world, it's the prosecutor who does the investigation, and then the evidence is presented in the courtroom, and usually the defendant confesses. And so the whole process of establishing guilt and innocence is different. And American trials are about show. They're very theatrical. It's dramatic. What happened was there was no show in Kharbarovsk. That these 12 soldiers all came in and confessed. And the evidence was read, and the confessions, and everything was done in a very businesslike way. The whole trial took only a few days, 4 or 5 days, and it was over. And it happened right at the end of the year, right between Christmas and New Year's. And it didn't make its way into the American press because there was nothing flamboyant about it. Plus, the Soviets had excluded the Western press from being present. They made a very serious tactical blunder in that they had not allowed witnesses from the West to show up and participate and write these breathtaking stories from the courtroom drama. And so it was a lead balloon. It just went blow up, and nobody cared, And that's why it was so readily dismissed as just Soviet propaganda. There was no show. It wasn't flamboyant.
Right. Well, no, it makes total sense. And it's, especially when you compare with the phenomenon of something like Nuremberg, where it's remember, which is, it's part of the story, right? They prosecuted a bunch of Nazis. They also, cough, cough, Klaus Barbie, cough, 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 there's a there's a fuller, more complex story there. I guess one thing that's, like, then I guess that sort of, that helps establish then. So it means that, like, when your dad later encounters these allegations, like, the Western world is like very, like they have already not, like, the opposite of primed to receive them. They've been just told that this is, like, they've been made to ignore it, I guess.
Yeah. It was not publicized in the West. So very few people knew that there had even been a Carbaros trial, much less what had been concluded in that trial. That there is a sort of omission of information, which is a form of censorship as well. That they're just sort of, that the Western press kind of voluntarily ignored it because it was uninteresting. It didn't sell papers, So the best thing was to just sort of lampoon it or to put it down dismissively as Soviet propaganda. So, but if you read the trial transcripts and stuff, it's very clear that these events actually did happen. That they're a testimony to actual crimes and events of the war. And it is part of the historical record of the war. So you can't talk about the war without discussing this or acknowledging that it happened.
Right. And so after these trials, then your dad at that time was in China. He was in Shanghai?
He was in Shanghai. Yeah, that's where the newspaper was.
Right.
So he was there, and one of his staff members had become a medic in the Red Army, and so he was getting reports from the war, from the front, and later from the prison camps themselves.
Oh wow! And what was it that he saw in this time also that, like, made him, or I mean, I guess perhaps by then he had been sympathetic to the Red Army or something, but America's official policy is like, so it's the position of people like Al Kohlberg and Plain Talk, and there's like this aggressive China lobby, and it seems like your dad is quite clearly not in that perspective. At that time, I guess, like, that division was really, really, really clear. I guess I'm kind of curious, like, how, like, those politics manifested in that moment too.
Well, there was a very powerful China lobby in the U.S., and they were very much pro Kuomintang, the party of Chiang Kai-shek. And they very much wanted China to become a capitalist state. And so there was a lot of anti-communist fear-mongering and effort on the part of very powerful people in the United States. On the ground, in China, though, it was possible, and many people saw this who remained in China after the revolution, that the communists were very much were social reformers, as I mentioned before. They wanted to improve the lot of the average Chinese person, and they were therefore engaged in things like installing sewer systems and getting potable water and establishing healthcare and just all the things that had been neglected. Setting up schools, free public schools, and hiring teachers and cleaning up the environment and disposing properly of trash and waste. All these things that we expect society or government to do, to fix potholes in the road. They were engaged in this. And so there was tremendous, after a social revolution, there's a honeymoon period where, there's so much that needs to be done and needs to be fixed that it's easy to see if you have an honest government and they're making efforts to address these and making resources available, that it's, if you can support that, you can see that, you can believe in it if you're on the ground, and you disbelieve the bullshit that you read in the foreign press, the opposition. My mother's story is actually pretty interesting too.
Please.
She went to China right after the war ended in the end of 1945, that she went with the United Nations Relief Agency, UNRWA, and they had, she and a girlfriend of hers had gotten this job through the United Nations, and that it was fabulous. They were in their 20s, and they were being sent to China, this exotic foreign land, and they worked at the UNRWA, providing aid and trying to get aid distributed to various parts of China. And my mother then was hired away from UNRWA by Madame Sun Yat-sen, and she became her personal secretary. And she worked for Madame Sun for about 2 years, and she met my father, and they had a wonderful romance and were married in China in 1947. And then she left Madame Sun to go to work for my dad on the newspaper. And so the two of them were running the paper, and it was a sort of a central place for reporters and the press, the foreign press, and everybody. That my grandfather had created an enormous library and resource there at the newspaper, and it was well used by Westerners. And so it was a real hubbub of activity.
Wow! And so then you said that your dad had you and your mom, like they're running the paper. They had somebody on staff, a medic who was sending back reports, who apprised them of that biological weapons were being used.
No, not necessarily. Those reports were coming from Chinese press.
So yeah, how did your parents encounter the story, I guess, is a better question.
Well, it was announced in the Chinese press. The first announcement of U.S. biological warfare came from Pak Hong-yong, the Korean foreign minister of North Korea, that he made an announcement in May of 1951 that the U.S. was using bacteriological warfare, and that there were incidents of outbreaks of smallpox in epidemic proportions in Korea, in South Korea, and in North Korea. And so that announcement didn't really get much traction. My dad ran an article about it in his paper, but other than that, there was nobody worldwide really picked up the story and went with it. It kind of died. And it's interesting because this first deployment of BW was a defensive deployment in retreat when China entered the war and pushed the U.S. Army out of North Korea. It was BW was dispersed in infected chicken feathers into homes and villages in North Korea.
One, what's the significance of the chicken feathers? And two, what is the tactical suggestion of the detail that it's happening while they're in retreat?
Well, you have to know a little bit about the history of the war to really answer the tactical question there.
I think you can get to that. By this time in the show, we'll have set up a bunch of it. So getting your perspective on it would just be very interesting.
Well, the war is interesting because there were 4 invasions, and each invasion had its reversal of sorts. But the first invasion was the North Korean invasion of the South that took place in July of 1950. And they drove all the way the South Korean army and the American forces that had remained in Korea at that time, drove them all the way down to Busan, and were about to push them into the sea when they were backed up by naval vessels, U.S. naval vessels, and managed to maintain a perimeter, an impregnable perimeter around the Busan. The second invasion is the well-known Incheon landing, whereas the North Korean army, the DPRK, is besieging Busan, and MacArthur lands a force behind them up at Incheon and cuts Korea in half, essentially, and traps the vast majority of the North Korean army in the southern part of Korea. And then it's a mop-up operation for the next couple of months while they round up 170,000 troops and displaced people and imprison them in various camps. And then 3 weeks after that invasion, which took place in September of 1950, in October, there is the invasion of North Korea from South Korea by MacArthur, and they push into North Korea and drive the remnants of the DPRK, as the soldiers that were remaining, and drive them up north all the way to the border of China. And this is when horrific atrocities occurred in North Korea. The barbarity of the American troop invasion is just staggering. The number and description of the massacres is appalling, and that's the reason this is a forgotten war, because of this carnage. And then you have the fourth invasion of the war. Actually, is not really, the Chinese don't consider it an invasion since they were invited into the war by North Korea, but it's the Chinese invasion of North Korea, attacking the American occupation forces, and then they pushed the Americans all the way south in a route, the worst route in American war history.
Well, there's also, though, like I.F. Stone presents it as like there's this like way in which the degree of the route is sort of exaggerated. Like, yes, like it's a victory, but it's like the U.S. is retreating because MacArthur wants permission, and as do his advisors, to then have an excuse to escalate the war even further and functionally initiate nuclear war, institute a naval blockade, etc.
Yeah, that's also is possible. I agree that tactically MacArthur expedited the retreat in order to create the emotional kind of climate in which he could declare all-out global war and use nuclear weapons against China and Russia. That's very true. I agree with that.
Well, so one of the things you mentioned in one of your papers specifically during this time, just about how brutal this period is what General Ridgway arrives on the scene as well. And I was kind of curious about like how, as you're just describing like this context and tactical shifts, what his arrival sort of augurs in terms of like in terms of the administration of the war and how lethal it gets.
Well, Ridgway's brought in for two reasons. One is that Welker is killed in an accident, in an automobile accident. Welker was MacArthur's general on the ground in Korea itself. And Ridgway is another of MacArthur's proteges, no doubt about it. Ridgway he's a Christian charismatic and a soldier. And so he's able to rally American troops to finally stand their ground after they've been pushed back, 50 miles or something south of Seoul. They finally hold ground. And then there's this lengthy period of time from December, towards the end of December of 1950 up until July, when there is kind of a intense battle going on between Chinese forces and American forces as the Chinese are slowly pushed back to the 38th parallel. And then in the interim, while this battle of attrition is going on, Chinese engineers have been constructing an underground Great Wall. And across the entire peninsula, virtually of North Korea, they've excavated and created a whole series of underground tunnels and warrens and supply lines. And it's a line that is essentially an S-curve over the 38th parallel, so that there isn't greater or lesser land lost on either side. It's pretty much the same as a straight line across. And they do this because they don't want the U.S. to lose face. That the Chinese are concerned that they don't trust the mental stability of MacArthur. And so they don't want a situation where he's going to be a loser and lose face and do something crazy like drop an A-bomb on him. So they construct this, and that becomes a defensible barrier. And that's the current boundary of North and South Korea today. It was a defensible line, and then the war just dragged on and became a war of attrition, and it forced the war into the negotiating arena. And that dragged on for 2 years. Negotiations to end the war in the last 18 months was all about prisoners and prisoner exchange.
Yeah. And then there's this, at the time that you're describing the this, the period when the Chinese, as Truman puts it, come in with both feet, the Americans are retreating and they're conducting this lethal bombing campaign as they're retreating, and they're sending the worst possible portrait back home to, inflate the possibility. You're saying it's also, you're saying, but it is in this time that there are reports of these chicken feathers that are being dropped, and yes, and that are biological agents. So yeah, so why the chicken feathers?
Yes, let me get back to that. This is a retreat tactic that's designed by MacArthur. Okay, he was indeed brilliant as a tactician. He was not a philosopher, but he was an excellent tactician. And so chicken feathers as a vector for containing diseases was invented by Ishishiro. This was his pet invention. This is what he figured out, that this is a magnificent medium in which to hide diseases. The chicken feathers float. You can drop them, you can have them in a bomb, you can blow up the bomb 200 feet in elevation above the ground and have chicken feathers dispersed. And then each chicken feather is contagious, can contain multiple various pathogens. And so what happened in retreat was that the U.S. used, and this is explained in a book that was written by Williams and Wallace, it's called Unit 731, that they found a British sergeant of a battalion who witnessed this. But his battalion was one of the last to retreat. And on their way out, they came across they went through a small village that was only 5 or 6 kilometers from the sea. And that there were these U.S. Special Service and military police supervising a group of people dressed in parkas, protective gear, that were pulling handfuls of feathers out of large canisters and running into homes of villagers and scattering and spreading these chicken feathers on the floor of their homes. And that this occurred not in this one place, but in several places where American soldiers had previously been, that smallpox broke out after about 2 weeks after the Americans had retreated, and the villagers had come back in to reoccupy their homes, and they cleaned them out and became infected. And so there was this epidemic that involved about 3,500 cases of smallpox infection with a 10% mortality rate. And this was reported in the international press. And this is what Park Hong-yong, the foreign minister of North Korea, had announced in May of 1951. So this was the first incident of trying to create a medical emergency behind enemy lines to as a total war tactic to disrupt their military ability.
And there's also, like at the same time as these as this is going on, there is the other dominant, sort of major, or I guess force in the war that's happening simultaneously is the rapid accumulation of prisoners of war in the South, and the early 1951 stationing of them at Koji Island. The majority of them, although they are, as you said, spread across a bunch of camps. So I know that we can integrate the POW part of it a bit later, but just acknowledging that, and then knowing that the next big phase of the BW allegations comes about publicly in 1952 in the narrative. How can you I guess sort of could you bring us from this moment when the North Korean foreign minister makes these allegations that basically only her dad reports, everybody else ignores them, and that's in May 1951 after MacArthur's been sacked. And then the following year, however, things the conditions are different and new allegations surface. What's that new context, I guess?
Well, according to the pilot POW confessions, the first use of BW begins in December of 1951. This is when the first the pilot briefings are, and the first germ bombs arrive, and the planes are equipped with them, and some modifications are made to drop these kinds of bombs. But the first sorties take place in December, right at the end of 1951. And so these are reported then in February, again by Park Hong-yong, describes numerous events where planes have flown over North Korea, and these canisters have come out of the planes that have not exploded, but instead have dropped and fallen apart, and insects have emerged out of them. Insects of all sorts, flies and spiders and mites and beetles and lots of different kinds of insects. And these insects are infested with various pathogens. And then 3 weeks later, China makes another claim. And Park Hong-yong is not given much press time, but the second claim is made by Zhou Enlai. And this one is respected and creates a huge furor worldwide, that Zhou says that essentially the same thing. And he goes through a very lengthy laundry list because the Chinese have had 3 additional weeks to study these insects to send samples back to laboratories in Beijing and have analysis done of agents of pathogens. And he comes out with an enormous laundry list of different diseases that are being tried out and being dropped. And essentially, the sort of the U.S. plan is to just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah, and where does your dad fit into the story at this point in time?
Well,
and not just your dad, by the way. I mean, like, also this is your mom as well. I don't want to just continue being like sexist and writing her out of this.
He announces it in his paper. I can quote you his announcement of that if you'd like. I mean, it's like.
No, that would be great. Please read as much of it as you'd like. I think that would be very cool.
"I'm Against Humanity" is the title. With millions of people dead and homeless in Korea as a direct result of the deliberate U.S. campaign of extermination, the latest American crime to come to light has been the launching of bacteriological warfare in Korea. Not content with wiping out entire cities and towns by napalm bombings, massacres of military and civilian prisoners, and campaigns such as Operation Killer, the Americans have resorted to one more bestiality in their frantic efforts to conquer the Korean people and extend their aggression in Asia. So that's my dad's opening paragraph announcing this story. That's pretty dramatic.
How is it framed and how is it received in the United States versus Europe versus, the rest of the world, et cetera?
Well, the claim by Joe, of course, is instantly denied by the U.S. and it's denied first by Secretary of State.
Atchison.
Sorry, I'm brain dead. Atchison, yeah. He's the first to deny it. And then there is a whole sort of cascade of denials which come down from there. Everybody then is on board. And there's a big campaign, a PR campaign that's launched to deny it. And so it becomes a propaganda war between the Chinese and the Americans and the British, essentially, that everybody is... the war switches from being a ground war to being a war for the hearts and minds of the planet, and so that's what happens with the BW story. And the U.S.'s position is continuously to deny it, and deny and deny and deny and deny, and it's never changed that tactic. It's just denial. Cloaked in various formulations, but always denial. And it's very hard to prove biological warfare. It's a very difficult task, and it's you can't really prove it beyond circumstantially.
Well, so that's I want to stick with that point actually for kind of a moment, because I think that in your piece. In the magazine Socialism and Democracy, although it's been reprinted, I believe, in Counterpunch, you deal with quite substantially with the issues about what proof that this stuff took place means. So I guess because I think if I could just ask a few specific questions, because I think your answers to them will kind of illustrate this really well. You specifically said we only have circumstantial proof. What is the evidentiary standard that has generally been demanded of these crimes, and what is the evidence that exists and that we have, and the gulf between them?
Well, that's a good point, because with this particular subject, there does not seem to be a definitive standard. I mean, is it the preponderance of evidence? Is circumstantial evidence sufficient? Do you need our witnesses' testimony to be allowed? I mean, if you have lots of witnesses to an event, but they happen to live in little villages in North Korea, how are their voices to be heard in the international stage?
With the Cold War over, with the post 1991, how do endeavors like, say, the ISC investigation then get framed? How do they get then, how are they, functionally discarded, if not actively? Are they actively, quote unquote, debunked or something?
No, the ISC investigation is the best evidence that we have that biological warfare did take place in Korea. That their investigation is exceedingly thorough. And their conclusions, are the most accurate. And they say on 5 particular occasions that there is sufficient evidence for a conviction of guilt of this war crime. And they went about it by establishing an incident report analysis. And they thought it through. They said, what all do we need to have as conclusive evidence that biological warfare took place, And so they established a set of circumstances that you need to have witnesses to the airplane flyover. You need to identify a flight path and such. You need to have witnesses to canisters falling down. You need to have witnesses to finding canisters or whatever in the field and insects emerging from them. You need to have laboratory analysis of the insects to see if they're carrying pathogens. And if people get sick and die, you need to have pathology reports and autopsy reports of dead people. And if you can get all that and tie it to one particular incident, then you have pretty conclusive evidence that this crime actually did exist. If you're missing parts of it, you can still believe it and assume that it's probably true, but you can't really convict unless you have, sort of a full spectrum of circumstantial evidence. And so that's what they did. They looked at hundreds of incidents that were reported, and they narrowed it down to 5 incidents, which they said, in these 5 cases, we can say definitively that these were acts of biological warfare. And I took 667 pages to say that and to put in all their documentation and lab reports and stuff, but that was their conclusion.
And so we know then, the ISC findings are disregarded in the West or suppressed actively. But the other dimension of this, of course, is, where your family comes into the picture, I think, right? And I'm kind of curious about how that, how you want to sort of present that story. I'm speaking, of course, specifically about the process, because I am not I'm getting timeline wise, I'm not off in introducing the prosecution of your folks, right?
That's a later part of the story, but I think that in terms of the reportage that my father and my parents were engaged in, that they didn't. Let's see how to say this. We have this notion of journalism as balanced reporting. That in America, that good journalism is balanced. You got to get both sides of the story. Okay, but what balanced reporting often does is it allows corporations and lawyers and governments to lie. And so you'll have a whistleblower that will say one thing, or you'll have a little community that says our babies are dying of leukemia because this company is polluting us, and the company will say, no, it's not. And it's a fat lie, but they cancel each other out. And so nothing gets done. And so what my folks did was they presented the charges of North Korea and China against the U.S. for BW, but they did not give space to the U.S. government to lie in their paper and deny it. And so therefore they became branded as sort of tools of communist propaganda, because they weren't willing to let the U.S. authorities deny the charges in their paper. And that's what got them into trouble.
And so what did the trouble end up looking like? I mean, the prosecution of the press for foreign politics under different kinds of auspices, during this period, it is, it only happens in the context of Cold War politics. I mentioned, you and I, in a previous conversation, I mentioned the case of William Worthy, which is the example that came to my mind as an association. But, quite clearly, I guess my point is that, the prosecution of your parents, it was very political. The not inclusion of the perspective of the government was the basis on which that, they were prosecuted. But I guess what was the political context? What was the reasoning for going after them? And, what purpose did it serve?
Well, as I said, the U.S.'s position on biological warfare in Korea has always been denial. Deny, 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 deny. And one way you create that is by making the war forgettable. Another way is by suppressing any conversation or dialogue about it. And just general suppression of information. And you can hide it in files and make it very difficult to access through freedom of information. It doesn't really grant access to anything the government really wants to hide. And so those are sort of the methods. And so attacking my parents through the courts was a way of suppressing information about the war. Because the reason the war is forgotten is because it was so ugly. It was so vicious that we think of the Vietnam War as being particularly vicious, and we think of My Lai massacre. But the My Lai massacre was one of a few. There's dozens and dozens of horrific massacres that took place in North Korea that were much larger, with 400, 500, 1,000 people being killed at a time and machine gunned into trenches and buried. Whole countrysides being torched with napalm and villages burnt to, even tiny little structures were just burnt to a crisp. 4 million people were killed, in this war. And so the intensity of it and the viciousness of it is why the war has been suppressed. It's not forgotten because it wasn't instrumental in the making of the U.S. or U.S. foreign policy or whatever. It's forgotten just because it was so ugly. And the U.S. cannot allow its citizens, Americans, to really see how ugly it operates overseas and how vicious the American empire is. It surpasses pretty much any horrific regime in history. It's up there with the Aztecs and the Nazis, for pure brutality and mass murder.
If you could talk, I guess, a bit about where the indictment came from and how the prosecution came together.
Okay. Well, my folks came back to the United States from China in 1953 with me and my brother John, and they didn't have much in terms of assets because the paper had folded, and so they were broke when we landed ashore here. Anyway, my dad tried to get work in the newspaper business, and he was officially or unofficially blackballed. He couldn't get a job for any paper. And my mother got a job then working for a child welfare organization. And my father then kind of went on a lecture circuit and went around talking about China and what was happening in China, and giving these fairly glowing reports about the communist government there. And then he was, in the midst of this, he was subpoenaed to testify for the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Internal Affairs, which was known as the Jenner Committee. It was named after Senator Jenner, a right-wing Republican from Indiana. And anyway, they interrogated him, and it turns out that the lawyer for the committee was this guy, Alva Carpenter. And Alva Carpenter had worked for MacArthur, that he was MacArthur's legal beagle at Supreme Command Allied Headquarters in Tokyo, and that he had been personally responsible for the amnesty of Ishishiro and all the war criminals, the BW war criminals of 731, that this guy Carpenter had worked behind the scenes with the tribunal to get them out of prosecution, to eliminate any mention of them in the historical record. Carpenter had been the wheel there. And so in this committee meeting then, interrogating my dad, Carpenter is up there yelling and screaming at him and calling him a communist sympathizer and a mass murder, and all kinds of nastiness. So that was resulted then in an indictment that the committee then recommended to the Justice Department that the grand jury be put together and an indictment be ordered against my father for treason. And then my mother was interrogated out on the West Coast in San Francisco by this the Senate Judiciary Committee run by Patrick McCarran, who was another really rabid right-wing McCarthyite from Nevada. And so she was grilled, and she refused to speak and told them essentially, I take the Fifth Amendment on all their questions. And so there was a grand jury put together in San Francisco because they had opted to live there, and an indictment was handed down, and it was a 13-count indictment, and it was assigned to Judge Goodman, and the prosecutor was a guy named Robert Schnacky. And so this was in 1956. Well, actually, the indictment came down in 1955, and then the trial did not come to pass until 1959. It took a long time, and then it only lasted 3 days, and the judge in the process misspoke and had to declare a mistrial. And then the whole thing kind of fizzled out after that. But the importance of the trial really is in all the pretrial motions and things that went on before the trial actually happened. That there was a lot of very interesting legal maneuvers and behind the scenes things that occurred in the trial. But it effectively shut down any dissent, though. That by using the legal hand of the government, the courts, the U.S. government was able to squash any kind of dissent, any kind of revelations about the truly horrific conduct of the Korean War, by stifling, by showing what it could do to my parents. And that's kind of the nature of the case, the big picture.
I guess then, what do you think, what was the effect that it had on your family? I mean, to be the subject of a federal prosecution, it took so long to even get to trial. What was the experience of that long delay like?
Well, it was good and bad. It was frightening for me as a child because I was, I don't know, 4 or 5 when things kicked off, and there'd be fundraising meetings and mailings and stuff. And one of the things the trial did was that it made an enormous number of friends for my parents, that people came out of nowhere to support them. And it drew together people that had been in the left. And the left was, at that time, at the end of the 50s, had been beaten on by these various investigative committees of the Congress, HUAC and the McCarran and Jenner committees, and was in retreat. And Khrushchev had announced all the purges and the huge human toll that Stalin had taken in Russia, and the gulags and all of that. And a lot of the left had quit the Communist Party, and the left were sort of the vanguard. I mean, the Communist Party was the vanguard of the left. And so the left was in substantial retreat, and here was an issue that could rally the left. And Ethel and Julius Rosenberg had recently been executed in Sing Sing. So they became sort of a cause célèbre of the left. And so they gained an enormous number of friends and people, and it enriched their life. And as a result of that, they really had a fabulous and wonderful life. But it was very trying because of the example of the Rosenbergs, that they had been executed for treason. And, that was a real possibility. So it was frightening. And, I was sheltered from it as a child. My brother, who's a couple of years older than me, understood what was going on much better than I did. But I would get his sort of versions of it, in watered down form or in scary form. But it was, it was tough. I think that it really made their lives interesting. And the things that happened in the trial are really informative. And the case is still cited for the things that happened in preparation of the trial itself and the rulings that were handed down.
Yeah, I guess as a way to wrap it up, I mean, that seems like a good place to sort of discuss is, the legacy of the case and what you understand it to be. And I guess also the other thing I was thinking about was your dad's article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in the early 1980s, which I thought was a super interesting chapter.
Let me talk a little bit about the trial, though, because I think this is really kind of fascinating. There is the indictment and the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings that led to the trial. But then the indictment was a 13-count indictment. So it included things like publishing body count statistics of American soldiers killed or wounded and captured. It claimed that the U.S. negotiators had delivered. These are things that the grand jury indictment claimed that my parents had done. These are the crimes. Okay, these are the counts. And then there was the claim that the U.S. negotiators had deliberately stalled the truce negotiations, that the U.S. Air Force had bombed and strafed the Chinese and North Korean truce delegation in the neutral zone on multiple occasions. There was a claim that the U.S. had launched biological warfare campaign against North Korea and China. There was a claim that the Army doctor, General Crawford Sams, had led a U.S. naval vessel into Wonsan Harbor in North Korea to kidnap it was masquerading as an epidemic control ship when it was actually loaded with these biological installations that were used for testing germ weapons on North Koreans and Chinese prisoners that were captured on shore and brought to the boat. It claimed that the collected physical evidence in North Korea and China had proved that the U.S. Army had committed war crimes. It claimed my father had said that General Omar Bradley had intimated to Congress about a spectacular new weapon that would bring the war to a quick end. It claimed that Dean Acheson was lying to Congress, and the American people claimed that U.S. forces were suffering tremendous casualties unreported by the U.S. government. Claimed that the United States government was internally corrupt. Claimed that foreign policy of the United States was morally unjustifiable. And it claimed that the president and government officials and military officials were reprehensible. So those were things that my father had said in his newspaper that he was being indicted on. Now by today's standards, that doesn't sound particularly heinous, These are all kind of general claims that are made, political claims.
Well, I mean, and it's crazy because it's also, to me, it's a very McCarthyite trial and experience, except it's at the end of the 1950s. And I would imagine that this experience also, and it was initiated in the days of Truman. In some measure, I mean, at the very least, the Korean War started with Truman. So, which is just to say that this isn't some partisan thing, that this is, part of a kind of, this very intense fervor, I guess is one way to put it, that had gripped the country for some time and was kind of endemic, throughout society.
Yeah, it was a mindset. This fear of communism allowed for a lot of speculation. But, we fear Muslims. We fear communists again, We fear homosexuals. We fear a lot of stuff, And so that kind of, the fear-mongering is part and parcel of governance. It's become that way in the United States, It's just we're pushed fear all the time. We subsist on a diet of it. At least the news is.
Absolutely. I think part of the idea too is that by making everybody, in this so permanently stimulated with fear, it's part of, take the brainwashing stuff, for example. It is able to, it's functionally the brainwashing thing is one part of a scare, of a psyop, if you want to call it that, fine. But the idea is, it is a way to try and allow, or, it's a very, it's very anti-democratic by its nature. It's an attempt to subvert the public's, the natural dialectic of how the public would understand the actions of their government, the actions of their military. It's an attempt to, present a false portrait.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what it is, or at least a very one-sided portrait, and. But anyway, what was interesting about the trial was that the two lawyers that my folks hired, A.L. Weirin had been with the ACLU, and he'd been a labor lawyer, and he'd worked in the trenches for a long time, and this was going to be the climax case of his career. He was going to retire afterwards and write books, And then Doris Bryn Walker was the associate counsel, and she had been a member of the Communist Party and had put herself through law school at UCLA, and she was a real firebrand. And Weirin went after witnesses, and he said that My parents decided to fight the charges. There was no possibility of a plea bargain, I mean, it would have, because each count carried a 10-year sentence and a $20,000 fine.
So, like, the way it was structured was, I mean, which is to say that the basis on which they would be negotiating, the penalties would still be so high that it was not even like a risk worth considering.
Exactly. Yeah. And it would have destroyed our family. And then they had support network that from on the left in San Francisco, you had this long tradition of left-wing politics going back to the 1934 general strike, and so there was a lot of support on the left. It was a good place to hold this trial. So Weirin went after witnesses. They were going to fight tooth and nail. So Weirin said that all my witnesses are over in China and Korea, that my clients have a right to bring witnesses. The Fifth Amendment guarantees it, to testify on his behalf, or I think it's the Sixth Amendment, the right to a free trial, and that all the witnesses are over in China, and so we need to be able to bring these witnesses over here, and the state has to pay for it. Well, the prosecutor balked at that, said, no, there's no way that, and the U.S. did not recognize the government of China, the People's Republic of China. They were still recognizing the Kuomintang and the nationalist government in Taiwan, and there was no judicial exchange agreement between China and the United States. So there was no way to bring Chinese witnesses, these doctors that had done the research and scientists who had done the analysis for the ISC report, to bring them over. And so Weirin said, well, I got to go to China then and take depositions. Well, the State Department, the Passport Department refused to validate his passport for travel to China and North Korea. So he came to the judge with this dilemma. How am I supposed to provide defense for my client, which he's constitutionally allowed or provided for, if I can't go to China and collect depositions? So the judge told the State Department and the Passport Department, I'm going to have to drop the case if you don't validate his passport. So anyway, Weirin got his passport validated and got to go to China, and he was supposed to be there for 2 weeks, collect depositions. He ended up staying for 8 weeks. He had a good time in China, enjoyed himself, and all of it had to be paid by the U.S. government. So that was Weirin's role. And then Doris Bryn Walker, she went after the documents, and she filed this request for documents that is just mind-boggling. It's in the record of the trial, which is in some file in, I don't know, in Oklahoma or some repository. You can get all the back trials of the federal courts. But anyway, she went after the documents, and she went on a fishing expedition and demanded all these documents that would substantiate the claims, the reputation that she was making of each one of the counts of the indictment. Like, she wanted the records, she requested the records of the instructions that were given to the negotiating committee at Panmunjom. She wanted records of the bombing attempts that were made against the Chinese and North Korean delegation at the peace talks. She wanted the records of General Sam's expedition into North Korean waters with his plague ship. So she came up with this list, and every issue on the indictment that she had documents that she wanted the government to produce. And so the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Defense Department balked at this time. And so there became a conflict, an internal conflict between the Department of Defense and the Justice Department and the State Department as to whether to pursue the trial. That the Defense Department wanted to drop the trial, because they didn't want Doris rummaging around in their files. Who knows what would turn up. I mean, all this dirt could go all the way back to Ishii and the amnesty deal that MacArthur had done. They knew she would find some shit. And so they didn't want to give her anything. And the State Department didn't want to give her anything, but they wanted to prosecute, and so did the Justice Department, because they'd all moved to the right. As soon as Eisenhower came in 1953, he brought all these Republicans in with him, and it was the first time the Republicans had any power in Washington for 20 years. So anyway, they prosecution refused to provide or to comply with the subpoena for the documents. And so the judge, in order to allow that the prosecution had to come up with something. So Schnacky came up with a deposition, which was the biggest revelation of the trial at all. He acknowledged that the U.S. government had the capability and had the weapons to engage in biological warfare. He admitted that in trial documents and claimed that they were stateside and not sent overseas, which was kind of a tenuous conclusion, but he had to admit that the U.S. at that time had the potential to engage in biological warfare on that scale in Korea at that time. Anyway, so that's what happened in the trial, and why it turned into a mistrial was that
the judge.
Well, the judge, Schnacky, I think it became really clear to Schnacky's handlers that he'd been outmaneuvered by Weir and by Walker. That they had outmaneuvered him in terms of their legal attacks against the federal and Schnacky hadn't dealt with them in a sufficiently significant way. He hadn't been able to put him down. The judge had been a constitutionalist and had required the state to comply with the arguments, the legal arguments. He wasn't a liberal, but he just wanted to see the law upheld. This one's going to turn into a fiasco for the government. That once that Doris and the AL got some witnesses on the stand, that it was going to blow the government's case out of the water.
Right.
And so they wanted to shut the case down, and I think the judge was complicit in that. And I think it was set up. I don't have any evidence, of course, for this, but in my view, just going back and look at the trial record and stuff, I think it was deliberate. But anyway, Schnacky tried to bring on these witnesses from the camps in North Korea, U.S. POWs, who had been required to read the Bill's articles in the Review as part of the indoctrination in the prison camp. And so Doris objected.
Yeah, so just making them read the news, that's the brainwashing.
Well, the hitch is that sedition can only occur within the bounds of the United States territory and its marine possessions, maritime possessions. You can't commit sedition overseas. And the Review was located in China. It was an American editor in China reporting events in Korea. So there was a question of you can't have somebody who was in Korea reading the magazine testify in the case because they're not included. It doesn't matter.
Oh, because the act that's being described is it's unreal. Like it can't be considered as related.
It's not a crime because it didn't happen in the U.S. And so that removed 60-70% of the testimony that the state had. because they were gonna do this whole emotional bit and bring in all these people who were going to testify against my parents who had suffered in the POW camps in North Korea, and so they couldn't testify. Their testimony couldn't be heard. So then the judge dismissed the jury or sent the jury back to he had to sustain the objection of Walker to this testimony. And so they sent the jury out of the courtroom. So then the judge, in open court, in front of the press that was all there, had to explain the law to the prosecutor. And why the prosecutor didn't know it is beyond me. But he said, look, you got a prima facie case for treason, and you could get a conviction on. But instead, you've indicted them on the wrong charge of sedition.
Oh, wow. So it really was like this kind of clown show. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So then the reporter from the Oakland Tribune went running back to this newspaper, which is an afternoon newspaper, and they ran an article with a big headline saying that the judge played my dad in court and claimed my dad was guilty of treason.
Oh, wow.
No, the judge said that, So the judge was livid. I mean, well, he at least acted like he was livid.
Because it meant that the case had to end functionally.
Yeah. But what that did was it meant that they didn't have to bring up any of the evidence. The case was over, but the judge and the prosecution and the government did not then have to allow any documents to come up. Did not have to. The case lingered then for a couple of years until Bobby Kennedy came along and tossed it. Because he couldn't find two witnesses for a treason conviction, which is required by statute. So they just used this case and this prosecution and all this buildup and stuff to silence dissent. They never intended for the information to come out. Once they realized that Schnacky wasn't going to carry the ball for them in a successful way, the best thing was to bury it. And bury it in a way which showed that this is a big stick, and anytime we want, we can bring it out. So anybody who's got information about war crimes or anything in Korea, especially you GIs that were POWs, take a look at this. This is what can happen to you. And that's kind of how the case ended.
And that about does it for this bonus episode, our chat between Noah and Thomas Powell. Thanks to Thomas for coming on the show and making the time. And until next time, see you later.